But I'm just going to jump straight into it. There's a lie you've been telling yourself, and it's killing you, not physically, but spiritually, emotionally, and destiny-wise. The lie sounds like I'm not qualified, I don't have what it takes, people like me don't become leaders, I've already missed my chance. What else? Come up with some of them. And here's the tragedy. You've been believing this lie for so long that you don't even hear it anymore. It's just a background noise. It's like the soundtrack of our lives. But let me tell you what this lie is really doing. It is keeping you from digging up what you have buried. Remember the parable of the talents? The servant who buried his talent wasn't necessarily evil. Rather, he was afraid. He was afraid he wasn't enough. He was afraid he would fail. Afraid he'd be exposed as a fraud. So he buried it and called it being responsible. You know what the master called him? Wicked. Not for failing, but for refusing to try. And here's my question to you. What have you buried because someone or some voice in your head told you that you weren't qualified? Hold that thought, because today we're going to dig up what you've buried. Welcome to this first episode of the podcast. I hope to hear your thoughts, and we hope to have a great ride on this podcast. Let me guess what has been playing on in your mind, because this played on in my mind for a very long period of time. It sounds like, yes, that's great for other people. I don't have their background. I didn't go to the right schools. I don't have the right connections. I don't come from a family that, does those kind of stuff. Or maybe it's I'm too old. I should have started 10 years ago. I should have probably started this podcast 10 years ago, right? So those are some of the lies. I am too young. Nobody is going to take me seriously. Or maybe this is the cruelest one. I tried before and I failed. So what's the point of trying again? You see, this lie is a chameleon. It shifts depending on your insecurity. But underneath all these different versions of the lie, there is one single thing, which is you are disqualified. You know what makes this lie dangerous is that it sounds reasonable. Some of the excuses and the lies we've told are reasonable. It doesn't sound like an enemy. It sounds like wisdom. It sounds like self-awareness. It sounds like humility. But let me tell you what it is. It is fear dressed up in suit and tie. It is the voice of the servant who has buried his talent, whispering, don't risk it. Don't try. You just embarrass yourself. And here's what breaks my heart. You and I have been listening to that voice so long that we start calling it God's voice. You've convinced yourself that God is the one telling you to wait. God is the one telling you you're not ready. God is the one telling you to stay small. God is the one telling you not to start. Don't start this year. But that's not God. That's fear. God is the one who gave you the talent in the first place, and He's asking you the same question He asked the servant. What did you do with what I gave you? So let me paint a picture of what happens when you keep listening to that lie. Let me give you an instance of 3 persons. I've changed their names, but their stories are real and you can relate to any one of them. The first story is a woman called Grace, and she's 43-year-old, works at HR in a small company. And for the last 8 years, she had an idea, a business idea, a coaching program for women, transitioning in careers. She has experience and she has the expertise. She will probably have an audience, right? But every time she thinks about starting, the voice kicks in. You don't have an MBA. You're not a certified coach. What if people start asking for credentials? You don't have that. We're also in the era of social media or social proof, right? So she waits and she takes another course online, reads another book, tells herself, one more year, maybe in 2027, then I'll be ready. But here's what's really happening. Grace is waiting to feel qualified. Someone else is building the exact program she's supposed to build. And most times it's someone with half her experience, someone who didn't wait for permission. And the women who are supposed to be impacted by great leadership, her experience, her view on this issue, they are still stuck. They are still waiting, still wondering why nobody's helping them. A second story is a young man I call Marcus. 28-year-old, brilliant mind, sees problem the way nobody sees it. There are people that have this unique perspective of a problem. For the past 5 years, he has watched his managers make the same mistake over and over again. He knows how to fix it. He has the solution. But every time he thinks of speaking up in a meeting, he just has this voice. You're the youngest person in the room. Who are you to question what people with over, 20 years of experience have been doing? What if they think you are arrogant? Especially in societies that are a bit cultural, like Africa. So he stays quiet, he takes notes, and he's just hoping that someone else will say what he's thinking. But here's the thing. The company is losing money because of this exact same problem that Marcus could solve. And they will never know because he has never spoken up. Then one day, suddenly the company hires a consultant, someone with a fancy degree and a big firm behind them. And they say the exact same thing Marcus have been thinking for the past 5 years. And they get paid 6 figures for it. While Marcus gets maybe a 3% annual raise. Here's the third story. There's a pastor, let's call him David, 56 years old, been in ministry for 30 years, a faithful man, good preacher, loves his people, loves his community. But for the last 10 years, he has felt this nudge to write a book. To take everything he has learned, his experiences, his mistakes, and put it in a book. And that book could reach thousands of people he will never meet. A book that can outlive him. And every time he sits down to write the book, he's like, who is going to read this book? By me, nobody in a small town, right? You are not, Tim Kelly. You are not, think of all the big names in the Christian space. And there are already enough Christian books in the world. I struggled with this the most. So he closed the laptop, goes back to his Sunday sermon prep and tells himself, maybe one day. But here's what he doesn't see. There's a young pastor in another country struggling, burnt out, ready to quit. And the exact book David would have written would have saved that ministry. But that book doesn't exist because David never wrote it. Do you see the pattern? Across David, Marcus, Grace, good people, talented people, probably called people, but they are burying their talents. Not necessarily because they are lazy, but because they are disobedient. Because someone, some voice, whatever it is, convinced them that they weren't qualified. And while they were waiting to feel ready, the world keeps spinning. Problems go unsolved, books go unwritten, businesses go unbuilt, and leaders or people get unraised. And every single day, they are compounding the tragedy. And here's the worst part, right? Which is the key message in this episode. They are going to stand before the master and he's going to ask, what did you do with what I gave you? And they are going to say, I was afraid. I didn't feel qualified. I was waiting to be ready. And the master is going to say the exact same thing he said to the servant who buried his talent. You wicked and slothful servant. Now, let me tell you about my mentor. It was a man who lived with this same life for 17 years, but then something happened. His name is Peter J. Daniels. And if you've never heard about him, you're about to. Peter is born in Australia, a poor family, rough neighborhood. By the time he was a little boy, the world has already told him he's worthless. In an African context, you say you're stubborn, you're good for nothing, you're not going to become anything. But in all these words, one voice particularly stuck with him, one voice that became the soundtrack of his life for these 17 years of his life. He called this lady Miss Phillips. Miss Phillips was his teacher. When Peter was 9 years old, Miss Phillips looked him in the eye and said, Peter, you are never going to amount to anything. She didn't say it in anger. She said it like she was diagnosing a medical condition. Matter of fact, cold, final. You're never going to amount to anything. You're going to be a failure all your life. And he was just 9 years old. And she handed him this verdict, right? Now, here's what you need to understand. Peter was dyslexic, but in the 1940s, nobody called it that. They just called him stupid. He couldn't read like other kids. He couldn't write like other kids. He struggled with everything that came easy to everyone. And Miss Phillips, looked at him and decided this boy is defective. This boy will never amount to anything. And Peter tells this story passionately and says, for 17 years, he believed her. He left school at 15, became a bricklayer, put it his hand because his mind he thought was broken. By the time he was 26 years old, he has failed at businesses 3 times. He was broke, in debt, working by brick just to survive, and he was illiterate. At 26 years old, he was already married, but he couldn't read a newspaper. Miss Phillips' verdict was coming true. But then something happened, something that would, ultimately change everything. And that's, where we're going to next. Because while I'm telling Peter's story, it's also our story. It's also my story. It can also be your story, right? Let me take you inside Peter's head for a moment. And Peter tells his story over and over again that if you listen to his recording, you can know this story, like the back of your hand. Imagine you're 26 years old, so I'm just telling you about Peter, and he has been working since you were 15, manual labor, bricklaying, good honest work, but brutal on the body. And every single day you wake up knowing I can't read, you work You walk past a newspaper stand, you can't read the headline. You go to a restaurant, you can't probably read all the menu. You get a letter in the mail, you ask your wife to read it. And every time you have to ask for help, you hear Miss Phillips' voice, you're never going to amount to anything. Now imagine you try to start a business, you've got ideas, you have your drive, you've got the hustle, but you don't have education, you don't have connections, you don't have capital. So you try anyway and you fail ultimately. You try again and you fail. And you try the third time, you fail the third time. And with that failure, the voice in your head will get louder. See, Miss Phillips was right. You are not smart enough. You are not good enough. You are never going to make it. This isn't just Peter's, financial reality. It kind of became his identity as he tells his story. He wasn't just broke. He believed he was broken. He wasn't just an illiterate. He believed as Miss Phillips said, he was worthless. And here's a thing that should terrify you, that Peter was on a trajectory, and that trajectory was leading straight to Miss Phillips' prophecy of coming true. He was going to live his whole life as a proof that Miss Phillips was right. Do you get that? And it was a Thursday evening. Peter was 26 years old, and somebody had invited him to a Billy Graham crusade. Now, when Peter tells this story, he said he wasn't religious. He hadn't grown up in church, didn't know much about God. But he had nothing else to do that night, so he went. And he sat in a stadium with thousands of people listening to these American evangelists preaching about Jesus. And somewhere in that message, something cracked open in Peter. And he tells his story so passionately. Billy Graham said something that cut through the 17 years of life. God has a plan for your life, not a plan for smart people, not a plan for educated people, not a plan for people who have figured it out. God has a plan for your life. And for the very first time in 17 years, he heard his voice that was much louder than, the soundtrack of his life, which was Miss Phillips' word saying, you're not going to amount to anything. So Peter tells this story, and when Billy Graham gave the altar call, he walked forward and he gave his life to Jesus. Now, Peter didn't walk out of that stadium with a business plan. He didn't walk out with supernatural literacy. He didn't even walk out with money or connections or credentials. But he walked out with something much more powerful. A decision. He decided that Miss Phillips' verdict was no longer the final word in his life. He decided that God's opinion mattered more than hers. He decided that even if he didn't know her, he was going to build a life that proved her wrong. And that decision changed everything. I think Peter wrote a book that says, Miss Phillips, you were wrong. It's literally a book and it's an international bestseller. If you're able to get your hands on that book, I think you should read that book. The first thing Peter did after Billy Graham's crusade, he decided he needs to learn how to read. 26 years old, married, working full-time. He was about to teach himself the alphabet. Can you imagine that? To be a grown man sitting at your kitchen table, with 3 dictionaries and a radio. That's how he literally taught himself how to read. Learning ABC as a child. But Peter didn't necessarily care about his pride anymore. So he cared about his purpose. He cared about God had a plan for my life. So every night after a full day working in a bricklaying, he would sit down with his dictionaries. He would listen to English broadcasters on the radio, studying pronunciation, studying speech patterns, studying how words work. Without a tutor, without anyone holding his hand, slowly, painfully, Peter taught himself to read. This is someone who was dyslexic and he believed he couldn't amount to anything. Here's what you need to understand. Peter didn't wait till he felt he needed to start building. He started building while he was learning. He didn't say, I will start a business once I can read. He said, I will learn to read while I'm building a business, because he understood something that most people never learn. You don't get ready when you start. You start, then you get ready. You literally start and you get ready. Your faith precedes your competence. Exactly what Peter did, according to his story. And within 5 years of teaching himself how to read, Peter had, written his first book. Let that sink in. 5 years earlier, he couldn't read a street sign, but now he was writing books. He went on to read over 6,000 biographies, studying successful people, learning from their lives, training his mind as a hustle. And within 10 years, he has built a multi-million-dollar business empire. This was someone who, a few years back, couldn't read, was a bricklayer. He believed his life was worthless. Now he had real estate across multiple continents, construction, investment, and within 20 years, he has trained leaders in 6 continents. In front of presidents, prime ministers, has written books that sold millions of copies. Miss Phillips said he never amounted to anything. But here's what Peter actually became. One of Australia's most successful entrepreneur, best-selling author, a leadership trainer that's influenced millions, a man that turned a lie into a fuel. Now, let me tell you my favorite part of Peter's story, because years later and decades later, someone asked him, Mr. Peter, do you ever think about Miss Phillips? And you know what he said? I think about her all the time because every time I write a book, I think, Miss Phillips, you were wrong. Every time I stand on the stage, I think, Miss Phillips, you are wrong. And every time I train someone that's capable of becoming a leader, I think, Miss Phillips, you are wrong. He didn't hate her. He thanked her. And you know, sometimes he says that Miss Phillips is probably buried 10 feet deep in the grave because her beauty is inside. But one thing to know is that she gave him something powerful. A verdict to overturn, a light to destroy, a fire to build with. And here's the part that should actually outstand you. Peter isn't special. He wasn't born with a genius level intelligence. He wasn't born into wealth or privilege. He wasn't born with a natural charisma or confidence. He was dyslexic, poor. He was told he was worthless, but he made a decision. And that decision turned an illiterate bricklayer into a man that has changed the world. If you hear of Peter's goal in life to give out the most money that's ever been given out by any man, it astounds you that this was a bricklayer a few years back. Now, what's the question? What's the difference? What did Peter do that Grace, Marcus, and David aren't doing? What was the formula? Because if Peter could figure it out, maybe we can too, right? So we've seen the problem and we've seen a use case of Mr. Peter J. Daniels who, turned his world literally upside down. Now, let's talk about what I think is a formula and which is actually what I'm doing. And what I'm going to warn is that this formula or this is so simple, they're going to be tempted to dismiss it. You are going to think that can't be it. There's got to be more. But there isn't. Peter J. Daniel became famous for one thing: simple formulas for difficult problems. And this is the formula he used to go from never going to amount to anything to changing the world. Because here's what I've learned. Most people are being held hostage of one voice, one person, one moment, one failure, one verdict. I was held bound by it for a very long time too, right? For you, who is it? Maybe it's a parent who told you will never make it. Maybe it's a teacher who said you weren't smart enough. Maybe it's a boss who said you didn't have, leadership potential. Maybe it's a pastor that even said you weren't called. Or maybe this is the hardest one to identify. Maybe it's failure. For me, this is part of it. A business that didn't work, a relationship that fell apart, a dream you tried and you couldn't pull off. And that failure became a voice. That voice has been whispering to you ever since. See, you are not good enough. Don't go trying any other thing again. You will definitely fail again. But here's why this step matters. Because you can't fight an enemy you won't name. As long as that voice stays vague and unnamed, it has power over you, right? But the moment before you name it, you strip it of its authority. So I want you to do something right now. Seriously, don't wait until the episode is over. Do it now. Grab your phone, go to your notes app, and write down the answer to this question. Who or what has been telling me I'm not qualified to lead? Write down the name, write down the moment, and write down the failure. Just name it. Mr. Peter figured out who it was. For him, it was Miss Phillips. So figure out the name or the moment or the failure. Because here's what happens when you name it. It starts being this thing big, hanging over your head. It becomes a specific lie, a specific source, a specific something, and you can reject it. Which brings us to step 2. Reject the verdict. Now listen carefully. From my perspective, you are not rejecting the verdict because you feel confident. You are rejecting it because God said so. We are not worthless. We are all capable of life-changing missions, right? And this is where most people get stuck. They say, if I reject the lie once, I will reject the lie once I feel ready. Once I have proof that I am ready to start, once I have the business plan, I will now reject it. No, you reject the lie first, then God gives you proof. Peter didn't reject Miss Phillips' verdict because he built a successful business. He rejected it on the day he gave his life to Christ. When he was still broke, illiterate, still failing. He rejected it by faith, not by sight, right? How do you reject short verdict? Whatever that is singing, that is a soundtrack keeping you stuck, how do you reject it? You replace it with God's verdict. Miss Phillips says, you will never amount to anything. God says, I know the plans I have for you. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. This is in Jeremiah 29:11. The voice says you're not qualified. God says, I've chosen the foolish things of this world to shame the wise. The voice says, you've already failed too many times. God says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. This is 2 Corinthians 12:9. The voice says, people like you don't become anything. God said, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. 1 Peter 2:9. See, this isn't necessarily about positive thinking. It isn't about pumping yourself with affirmation. It's about submitting to a higher authority. God's opinion trumps whatever opinion that is negative every single time. So here is also what you do. Go back to your notes app where you have written down the negative lie that has been keeping you. Underneath it, write God says. And then you find one verse, just one verse in the scripture that says the exact opposite of what the voice has been telling you. You memorize it, you write it, you speak it out loud, because faith comes by hearing. You've been hearing the wrong voice for a very long period of time. It is time to hear God's voice louder. Then take an action. This is step 3. Take one action today. Not tomorrow, not next week, not when you are ready, not when. Just take an action today. As you are listening to this episode, in fact, close it and take an action. Because here's the truth that's going to sting. You don't prove people wrong, or you don't prove the lie or the voice wrong with just your words. You prove them wrong with your work. Mr. Peter didn't prove Miss Phillips wrong by telling her she was wrong. He proved her wrong by learning to read, building multi-billion-dollar businesses, and by writing books, by living a life that made her verdict irrelevant. Let me ask you, what's the one thing you've been avoiding because somebody told you couldn't? Not 10 things, just start with one. Maybe it is writing the first page of that book. Maybe it's making a sales call for that business idea, having one difficult conversation you've been avoiding, posting one piece of content you've been scared to share, signing up for one course that could give you a new skill, reaching out to one mentor you've been intimidated to, connect with or contact. What is it? You know what it is, because it is the same thing that makes your stomach tighten when you think about it. It's that same thing you keep pushing to next week. Yes, for me, it was this podcast. It is a thing that if you did, it will be the first shovel on the death of the lie you've been believing. Here's what you need to understand. That action doesn't have to be perfect, right? This video isn't perfect either. It doesn't have to be so big. It doesn't even have to be good. It just has to be done, because the goal isn't perfection. The goal is proof. Prove to yourself that that voice is wrong. Prove that you can take action even when you are afraid. Prove that you're not going to spend the rest of your life burying your talent. Yeah. The other aspect of it is that Peter didn't also become a best-selling author overnight. He tells that story. Instead, by learning one letter, one word, one sentence, he kept going, one action at a time. And that's why I'm asking you today to take one action today. Then wake up tomorrow, take another action. Then another one. Then another one. Because that's how ordinary people become leaders who change the world. Not one big giant step, just one faithful step, repeated every single day, until the life you have built makes this verdict laughable. Let me bring this home. 50 years after Miss Phillips, told Peter J. Daniels that he never amount to anything, he had built an empire, trained millions of people, written books. I'm trying to get onto his Destiny program. Written books that have changed lives. Stood in rooms with presidents and prime ministers. You know what? He never stopped thinking about her. But now, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Because she gave him something powerful. A verdict to overturn, a lie to destroy, a fire to build with. So what's your Miss Phillips, right? Whoever told you that you weren't enough, whatever failure told you should quit, whatever voice that have kept you from digging up your talent, they didn't disqualify you. They handed you a fuel. So here's my challenge. Take the next 24 hours, prove them wrong with your words, with your action. Identify the voice, reject the verdict, take one action and then do it again tomorrow and the next day and the next day, because that is how ordinary people become leaders who change the world. Not someday in the future, but today. Finally, Miss Phillips was wrong about Peter J. Daniels. Whoever told you weren't enough, they are wrong too. Now go and prove it. This is the Builders Podcast, and every week we study one builder. We dismantle one lie. You've got one move to make. Don't bury it. Build with it. I will see you in episode 2. Thank you.